Right, well, first of all, thank you for Dan, for giving me this platform to basically speak on, not shouldn't say basically, for giving me the opportunity to speak of my concerns towards my views of mental health charities, using tokenistic approaches of to engage lived experience volunteers from racialized communities. And also thank you, Jordan, for joining in and putting in your thoughts where you feel necessary and where you feel they are relatable too. And basically just, introduce to everyone else who may be unaware of what is going on. I've opened a petition calling all mental health charities to take genuine accountability and meaningful responsibility for their anti-racism policies throughout their mental health, throughout their organizations, apologies. And that comes from my own personal experience as the lived experience volunteer for multiple mental health charities, being felt that I am being used in a tokenistic way because of what came to light in recent affairs with the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd's death. And so, simply put, enough is enough, because I am absolutely sure every person on this planet that breathes is aware of racism and aware of how people are trying to be anti-racist. Some, I guess, but awareness where it is excellent, awareness on its own is inadequate. For example, you may be aware that it's raining tomorrow, but if you then don't take a coat with you tomorrow, that awareness has become frivolous. And so what I am asking from, I take that back, what I'm demanding for mental health charities at senior leader level is put a plan of action, to put engagement and to put collaboration into the spectrum, because simply put, action now needs to follow and not just awareness.
Agree with that. I mean, I think this is a really interesting conversation. We had some chats behind the scenes a minute ago, and I'm sure we'll get onto those. But what do you think, I suppose, sort of good looks like from an organisation who's taking some of the asks that you've talked about, Antonio? You know, what should be sort of the best practice that mental health charities and other organisations should be aiming for, in your opinion?
So I personally don't think that, this is going to be something that changes overnight. However, in saying that, I also don't think it gives the excuse that it should take its time. And so what I believe good looks like, I'll probably rephrase it to what I believe actual progress looks like. And that is, first of all, giving value to your lived experience volunteers from racialized communities and not just using them for knowledge, opinions, and keeping up with appearances. And if I try to break that down a little, when we have these reviews and feedback sessions, where is the action coming out of these reviews and feedbacks that we're giving to you? Are you, extracting our knowledge to make us feel valued, or are you extracting our knowledge to actually put action into place? And I think that's the difference to where good or progress is made. Along with that, you really need to value our time. I think we need to redefine what volunteering actually is. If you're willing to put yourself forward for voluntary sakes, then of course, but you shouldn't be indebted to a volunteer if you feel your time is too valuable. And, especially if you're being constantly requested upon to what seems to be changing policies around anti-racism.
See, this is one of those things, I can hear this and I can raise voices, and I can give you voices through our platform. I'm never, it's never going to happen to me. I'm never going to be the token black man. When I get approached by stuff, it's because I could argue, yes, to do with man up, the CEO, and all those buzzwords. I will never ever be pigeonholed into my race. I absolutely hate saying that, but I've seen this conversation so many times, and it needs to stop. It's just that tick list, isn't it?
And I was just going to follow that up with another question to some, because I think Dan set this sort of up quite well, that if you are a volunteer and you feel like you are just there for that sort of tokenistic, sort of point of view, what do you then do? What do you think is then the best course of action? Because there's going to be folks out there. How do you best sort of address your concerns around that from your own experience and others that you might have heard from, Antonio?
So this is a really important point I'm about to make, I believe, and to make that point, it's difficult to express your concerns as a volunteer. For me, especially and I speak from personal experience, I've always been sort of hardwired that as a volunteer, you don't want to let charities know how you feel about them. You want to just make the most of the opportunity you're given. And that then becomes very similar to how racialized communities deal with our mental illnesses, because that idea of, restraint from expressing yourself is how we feel expressing our mental illness. And so as a lived experience volunteer, I relive what I was living when I wasn't able to admit to my mental illness. And I feel almost shackled to being a volunteer, because I feel if I express my concerns, people will judge me again, the support will break down, and everything will just come crashing on me. And so you have the sense of keep private or make it known and feel ashamed that people will judge you and, just shun you for what you have done. And if you ask me, would it have made sense for me to take this petition campaign forward 3 years ago when I just started as a volunteer? Then of course not, because then people look at me and be like, oh, what are you talking about? You've just started. In the most respectful way, they would say, who are you? What have you done? But where I have had extensive experience now with multiple mental health charities, and now realized or noticed to read between the lines, I can take this stance and I can say enough is not being done. And also enough is enough of not doing enough, if that makes sense. And so I think it's a very tricky one. It's, I can probably presume there are a lot of volunteers who feel the same way, however, do not feel they have the courage, unfortunately, to step forward with their concerns, and probably feel they will just get shut down straight away. And that's also why I urge other volunteers to take strikes as I am, and abstain from giving their labor to mental health charities.
And do you feel there's a space where, if you've got an organisation who is approaching you as a volunteer, they're wanting volunteers, and they do say, actually, yes, we want a young Black man because you're from this area, you've got this job, you've had this background, this upbringing, this school experience, you've got the lived experience that we want to be able to support whatever our aims and objectives are. Do you feel that's a far more constructive way of getting volunteers without having sort of that tokenistic way of sort of dealing with it, because they've just sort of been out with it? What's your thoughts on that?
I think tokenism isn't always clear. That's the first thing. I think, people approaching a tokenistic way is not always clear, and that again is in my personal experience. It's taken me quite a while to realize that was the method of approach, in my opinion. And I don't think the example you've given is the best method, because it's almost a marketing technique. You're trying to make the opportunity sound as sweet as possible, and that you are of value and you are of importance. And however, I challenge that again with what I said previously. Awareness is great, it's tremendous, it's excellent, but your awareness needs to follow through with action. So if that is what you are proposing to me, I don't want to then a few months down the line or a few years down the line feel that what you mentioned to me at the start was only a tokenistic saying.
You're a wise man, dude. That's why I love having you on here. You genuinely are. I could listen to you for hours. I really could. You just a guy who's you just get it. You really do, and I'll all support you on that. I think your wisdom is just absolutely incredible, and that. So with me being a CIO, a CEO, and Jordan, what is your role with MANUP, mate?
I'm chair of MANUP. I take some of Dan's crazy ideas and make sure that they could actually work in practice.
Yeah, and don't upset people. If you're talking to us, what would you want me to do from right now as a CEO of a mental health charity? Do you know what? The mental health is irrelevant of a charity. What would you want me to change right now?
And I'll be honest with you, it's a very tough one because you're a very, very, very kind CEO. So it's a very tough one here. However, to keep my general approach, it is just to, you know, engage with your racialized communities. That you shouldn't, although it is a very complicated procedure, it shouldn't be filtered out as you go up the ranks. You know, you started MANUP because you're passionate for the cause MANUP is there for. And so in doing that, you don't lose your value through ego, and you don't lose your commitment through reputation. You maintain what it is that made you create MANUP, and in doing that, you engage with all communities. And, you know, I'm only addressing racialized communities because we all know why. I don't have to go into it, but it is all communities. And, you know, you want to show that you're not just a CEO, you are the person that started this for the reason it's there.
And I'll be honest with you, and I've said this to Jordan, one of the reasons I love having Jordan on, or even the trustees, or even yourself sometimes, is I am absolutely terrified that the more momentum we get, the more I'm seen as a CEO, the more desensitized. And it could easily turn into just a paperwork exercise. I don't think that will ever happen, where it's like, okay, we must have a black man on this video, we must have a gay man on this video. I don't think that will ever happen because we're just not like that.
I think you've hit the right sort of note with that, because Antonio, I saw, you know, your video you did on Instagram when you talked about, I think when you set things up at more of a grassroots level, you're aware of what's going on in your community. So actually, you're rising through the ranks. Actually, you become so much more detached from sometimes what you initially set up to do, and that you just get bogged down with meetings and HR and all of that sort of stuff. I think, Dan, that's sort of coming back to your point there. I think, you know, I'd like to think that MANUP is very rooted into men's mental health and the communities and the folks that we work with, and, you know, trying to maintain that. Whereas I think perhaps charities on a far larger scale, they are so far from some of the direct recipients that they're working with. Actually, you become so removed that, you know, you do need to be working with those folks, because otherwise, what you're doing there, you're going to have such a lack of relatability with people. How can you represent them? And I think that's, you know, perhaps that's another message that we need to start getting across to charities and organisations, because, you know, if you don't make sure you're getting back to the communities you're serving, then it's not going to be a good space.
Well, actually, Antonio, can I just ask you your opinion, thoughts, that kind of thing? So, for example, when I first started, or when we first started MANUP, way back in 2019, that first photo, originally it was just a drone photo, and we had a few hundred men just stood there. And I noticed, remember this discussion, I was like, why is it all white people? Couldn't understand it. And even as the momentum started to build up with MANUP, it was literally just all white men. And I started to question whether we're doing something which is borderline, which is cutting out that community. So I nearly started to try and cherry pick people because they were black. I wanted a spokesman. Actually, I nipped that in the bud very, very quickly. And I think, Jordan, we waited 18 months for that video with Nathan, but just because he was the right man to have that discussion. Do you remember that video with Nathan? That was a brilliant video, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's probably within the last 6 months or so. He was fantastic. And I think you hit an interesting point there, Dan, because I think some people perhaps did what we were doing, so okay, you need to get representation in quick, you know, who to call. And we did nip that in the bud, whereas I think some people haven't. That's been years. And that's the issue.
But with that, would you say that actually, okay, Nathan was, that just happened by accident. It's just what he was saying in another meeting. It was just absolutely incredible. I was like, I need you on MANUP, and I want to ask you the question. Would you say that's tokenism?
Oh,
Chucking that one at you there. I'm just trying to find that, like, that balance. Does that kind of make sense?
yeah, it makes sense. I think, you know, it's very important that to realize that in what I'm asking and what I'm talking about tokenism, there is a thin line, and you know, people sometimes unintentionally tread onto the line of tokenism, but you can tell when it's unintentional, when it is intentional. And so it is an uncomfortable, I guess, semantic to be around. And you know, at the end of the day, we do have to get uncomfortable, because that is the only way we feel the need to change. However, again, as I mentioned, it's very easy to tread over that line of tokenism, even in an unintentional way, because of the comfortability we've had around this whole field. And I would say that it wasn't tokenism on an intentional way, but again, everyone's perspective is very subjective. So some people might feel it was, some people might feel it wasn't, if you see what I mean. And so, I mean, it's a tough one, because yeah, it's just, you know, it's a thin line. But as long as you have acknowledgement, as you've asked me, as long as you have that acknowledgement, and then, you know, you question it and you think, maybe I should do something different, or, you know, take a different approach, that's also just as important, because it's not just, again, being aware of it, but it's you're taking action with it. And another point of that, I'd say, is that where somewhat, to some degree, there is truth, we do lack representation as racialized communities. However, hear me out, however, coming back to that, we lack representation because of all this tokenism that's going on. So we will forever lack representation if we don't first address the issue at its core, which is that tokenistic stigma and stereotype. After that, when you start to become uncomfortable and then comfortable with engaging with racialized communities, you can almost be sure that the lack of representation will not exist no more. There will be an I can't say the word, an increase in representation of racialized communities.
Yeah, that was a good video.